Mary Tamm, Second Generation, The Autobiography, Volume 2. Read by the Timekeys, Romana. Chapter 10. The Windy City. Since recording my final episode as Romana, I had, of course, done a great deal of publicity for Doctor Who, including magazine covers, TV chat shows, personal appearances, and press articles. I was not entirely new to this, as many readers will remember from Volume 1 of my autobiography, First Generation, where I described the PR machine that sprang into action after I'd completed the Odessa file. I was totally unprepared, however, for the new phenomenon that I now encountered, namely, the Doctor Who fan. Tom had warned me, during the filming of the series, that my life would not be my own once it hit the screens, and that I would be recognized everywhere I went. This prophecy had not been completely fulfilled, however, mainly because I was, and still am, largely unrecognizable off-screen. When I wear very little or no makeup, dress fairly scruffily, and, more often than not, wear glasses. Tom's appearance on the streets of London and everywhere else was almost identical to his screen personas, even down to the long coats and scarves he had a penchant for wearing. Also, he was readily identifiable by his imposing stature and wild hair, so it was a slightly different matter in his case. I'd witnessed his being mobbed by kids, which he seemed to enjoy. Once, when we were on a train together, the mobbing was directed at me, and I think he was none too pleased to be ignored on that occasion. The hero worship for the character of the Doctor was something I feel he had come to expect after so many years in the role. Adulation from the British Who fan was in no way threatening, although it did remind me of the time I had seen the Beatles in concert when they visited my hometown of Bradford in 1963, and caused me to recall the screaming girls who rendered the audience deaf to the music. I had been rather puzzled and even somewhat unsettled by it all, wondering why seeing the Fab Four in the flesh made people react in this way. Now, 4 years after I'd finished working on the cult classic Sci-Fi series, I was to visit the United States for the first time, having been invited to the first major Doctor Who convention, or WhoCon, in America, to be attended by a large number of Who luminaries: John Pertwee, Patrick Troughton, Peter Davison, Elizabeth Sladen, Carol Ann Ford, John Leeson, Mark Strickson, Louise Jameson, and more. My old pal Tom Baker was there too, with his agent in tow. In 1977, Tom's first 4 seasons as the Doctor had been sold to PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, stations across the United States, and the show had soon achieved cult status. The event also coincided with the video release of 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors, so the interest in our arrival in America was huge. The Spirit of Light convention was billed as the ultimate celebration of Doctor Who, and had a promised attendance of over 6,000 fans. It took place in Chicago over the weekend of November 26, 1983, and was organized by Norman Rubinstein, who generously told each of us to bring a guest along, all expenses paid. Marcus was thrilled to be traveling with me, as he had never been to the USA either, so it was a very excited couple that arrived at Heathrow on November 24th, ready for the transatlantic adventure that awaited us. The only cloud on the horizon was leaving Lauryn behind. She was 4 at the time, and our last vision of her was that of a small figure banging on the window, waving us goodbye, as we left her in the care of my parents for 7 days. We were to arrive in time for a grand Thanksgiving dinner, and I chatted excitedly with my fellow passengers on the plane, some of whom I already knew and some I didn't, about the forthcoming event and what it might entail. I was especially excited to meet John Pertwee and Patrick Troughton, both fine actors whom I greatly admired, and with hidden talents which were soon to be revealed. We had all been invited to stay for a week, so had plenty of time to relax, shop, and sightsee before and after the convention. We landed at New York to change plans and prepared to go through customs. This proved to be a very different experience to passing through the borders between countries in Europe. A very large, tough-looking customs official snarled terse questions at me, whilst checking my passport photo closely. After I'd convinced him I was harmless and merely a visitor to WhoCon, He turned his threatening attention to Marcus. He did not address him, but turned back to me. "And who is this guy?" he barked loudly. He's my husband," I stuttered, feeling obscurely but completely guilty for being married. "Yeah? And what is his purpose on this trip?" I had a mad impulse to say, "To service me," but wisely forbore and replied lamely and timidly, he's just along for the ride," which was nearly the same thing. The customs man frowned, gave us both the once-over again, stamped our passport and growled, "Go through now." "Whew! Welcome to the United States, ma'am. Have a nice day." After due course and more bonding with the other Who actors on our next plane, we reached Chicago, where the weather was bitterly cold and frosty. Apparently we were in the middle of the coldest winter for years. Temperatures on Christmas Eve that year fell to -75. This did not dampen our enthusiasm in any way. In fact, the wintry landscape only enhanced our sense of far-flung adventure, having left a relatively temperate England behind. We trailed into a very grand, luxurious hotel, which was as warm as toast, and were greeted by Norman, who turned out to be a genial, affable guy. He welcomed us effusively and exhorted us to go to our rooms and freshen up before the dinner. Marcus and I traveled up the glass elevator to the 75th floor in some awe, passing huge sculpted ice angels in the atrium and crystal chandeliers glittering on every floor. Everything was, as the cliché of all things American was widely mooted to be, on an immense scale. I had always thought the concept a myth, but now realized it was even more larger than life than I'd ever imagined. As with most clichés, the truth was even more fitting than the fantasy. We reached our room and flung open the doors to reveal a suite on 2 levels. We ran up and down the spiral staircase like a couple of excited kids, marveling at the facilities and luxuries therein. 2 huge TVs, a sumptuously appointed sitting room that our house in London could have fitted into, a circular bed that would easily accommodate 6, a resplendent full-size bar, and large walk-in wardrobes. We had never seen the like. It was almost a wrench to leave the suite after we had dressed for dinner, to go down and convene with the others for the Thanksgiving meal. It was a wonderful time of year to be in America, celebrating this ancient custom, which was, of course, not in our English calendar. It added to the excitement of realizing that I was actually there, a country I had always wanted to visit, and of which I had only scant knowledge from TV series and movies. Hearing the accents spoken around me was surreal. It took some while to get used to the fact that we were not on a film set, and that the natives spoke this way all the time, not just in the movies. My parents had escaped from Estonia as refugees in 1945, and had made their panicky way to the harbor to get on a boat which they thought would be taking them to America. They got on the wrong one and ended up in England instead. I allowed my imagination to have free rein now, and wondered idly what would have become of me had I been born in the States. Would I still be an actress? I certainly would not have been a guest at such a British TV-themed event as this, so would I have been an attendee? As my stay in Chicago progressed, and I started chatting to the people I met, I felt more and more at home. It was, as Marcus pointed out, no real surprise, as they were nearly all descendants of immigrants, like me. I had always felt isolated and special as a first-generationer back in the UK, and now here I was in a country that was full of them. I experienced a very warm and friendly feeling for them all, as we were all in the same boat, so to speak, or at least it was not impossible that some of our relatives had been. The Thanksgiving dinner was delicious, as it consisted not only of the turkey and trimmings which we were all familiar with, but other new foods, like pumpkin, a first for me, which I found to be delicious. After coffee and liqueurs, we repaired to the hotel's champagne bar and imbibed freely, knowing we had nothing to do the next day. John Pertwee, a lovely, witty, and very charming man, appointed himself entertainment's director, and the following morning marshalled us all from the hotel foyer onto a train which took us to the city centre, where we shopped till we dropped, visiting such stores as Neiman Marcus and Macy's, all familiar by name, but so much more thrilling in reality. My lifelong addiction to shopping began that day in America, as everything was so cheap and plenteous in a comparison with England. The range of goods was staggering too, and I bought toys for Lauryn, knickknacks for the house, and Christmas gifts for friends and family, all the while marveling at the twinkling light-laden trees that bordered the wide skyscraper-lined avenues. The seasonal decorations far outclassed anything I had seen before, anywhere in the world. I had previously visited quaint little Yuletide markets in Germany when I had been filming the Odessa File, and had thought those fantastic at the time, but they had nothing to rival Chicago's Christmas offerings. My love affair with the United States had well and truly begun. John had agreed a meeting place and time at the end of the day, which we all duly complied with. Soon we were on the train on our way back to the hotel, comparing our purchases and marveling at each other's choices. It was hard to remember that we were there for a different purpose, though. The convention schedule was heavy and involved a 12-hour day. We had autograph signings, photograph sessions, and lengthy question and answer periods with the audience in a huge theater, which were known as panels. We worked very hard, but no one complained, especially as the meeting at the end of the day in the champagne bar became a nightly ritual and gave us all a chance to relax and unwind. One morning, as I was coming down the escalator leading from the first floor to the atrium where the ice sculptures were, and where the hotel foyer was situated, I had given up trying to drag Marcus out of the suite to accompany me on my convention duties, so enamored was he with American television and room service, which offered him a meal that had quickly become his favorite of all time, eggs benedict. He consumed it with great relish at least 3 times a day. As I returned to the suite each evening to change for drinks and dinner, I fully expected him to have turned into a surreal version of Humpty Dumpty, or a giant boiled egg. I yawned lazily as the escalator began to descend, smiling inwardly at the mental image I had evoked of my husband, when suddenly my reverie was rudely interrupted. A screaming was coming from below, becoming louder and louder as the escalator made its slow downward progress, a screaming which consisted of hundreds of female voices, shrill and piercing. I looked down. Now I am as blind as a bat, and though I had glasses for myopia, I was so vain in those days I rarely wore them publicly, preferring instead to stumble around short-sightedly and hope for the best. I squinted in puzzlement at the crowd below, and as I drew nearer and nearer, began to realize that not only were they screaming in a kind of ecstasy, but they were also pointing at something which I took to be behind me. I turned round and saw nothing. I looked down again and realized, with a kind of slow-motion, dreamlike horror, that they were screaming my name and pointing at me. Well, I did not even think. As fast as greased lightning, I turned in abject terror and ran up the down escalator as quickly as my sleepy morning legs could carry me. I arrived back at my room panting and frantically banged at the door of the suite. Marcus answered, nonchalantly wiping a dribble of egg yolk off his chin with an immaculately starched napkin. "Back so soon, darling?" he inquired. "You're just in time for Johnny Carson." I collapsed on the sofa in hysterical laughter and told him of what had just happened. He chuckled, and God bless him, deserted his eggs benedict to escort me back downstairs, in the elevator this time. The American Who viewer in those days was a fanatical aficionado of the program, and no mistake. The girls at the Beatles concert had nothing on the gals here. Not only was I staggered beyond words to discover that most of my fan base in the States was female, but the lengths to which they went to express their appreciation was almost unreal. At one of the panels in Chicago, I walked onto the stage to a round of thunderous applause and looked out over a sea of white. I managed to screw up my eyes sufficiently to make out what I was looking at. I was assailed by the sight of literally hundreds of females among the blokes, all dressed in a version of my first costume as Romana. The expertise, time, and trouble they had taken to make their costumes was extraordinary. I had the unenviable task of judging the best at a gala evening at the end of the con, and it was almost impossible. I felt weird about it all, as it was the character that I played that they were identifying with so strongly, not me. I also had a very strange feeling of not knowing who I should be, whether they expected me to talk and behave like Romana, or whether I should just be myself and risk disappointing them. I opted for the latter and felt more comfortable instantly. Nowadays, the fans all over the world are much, much more laid back, as they've seen us all in the flesh countless times. But back then, when the Spirit of Light convention was the first of its ilk, With so many Who actors in attendance, I suppose they were just overwhelmed by it all. Again, the power of Doctor Who never ceases to amaze me. It took a while for the hysteria to die down, however, and I had other, even more hairy experiences on the convention circuit in America, which will be all related in due course. A great highlight of the WhoCon for the fans, and a rather nerve-wracking one for us, was the cabaret, which had become a familiar staple of cons worldwide now, but was again a new experience for me in Chicago. We all had a turn which varied from reciting poetry, doing a Shakespeare piece, not for me this one, too reminiscent of auditions and all the angst that they evoked, or singing. We, the Who thesps, all did our bit, although some had wisely declined to join in, but merely watched from the sidelines. Mark Strickson was superb, as he sang satirical songs about Doctor Who, and Sarah Sutton sang a Victorian music hall song, complete with costume. But the star of the evening was undoubtedly John Pertwee, who turned up with a guitar and accompanied himself as he warbled tunefully through some very funny self-penned ditties. He then launched into routine as his other famous screen character, Worzel Gummidge, which had us all in stitches. He definitely padded out the night of entertainment, which would have been mercilessly brief otherwise. None of us had hitherto guessed what a fine minstrel he was. Another dark horse was Patrick Troughton, who had brought along some wonderful paintings which he had incredibly executed himself. He gave a brief lecture on them as the audience marveled at his artistic expertise. I'm afraid to say my paltry poem recital was rather pathetic in comparison to these acts. But, as a wise Thess pointed out to me, we could have all merely read out a list of names from a phone directory, and the fans would have been just as delighted. Not too sure about that one. On the final night, we were all called onto the stage by way of a grand finale. It was hysterically funny to see the 4 doctors jostling to queue up in order of importance. There was a terse scuffle behind the scenes before they all burst onto the stage together, like a gang of eager puppies, to a tumultuous reception. And so the week drew to a close, and we had all had a simply wonderful, albeit exhausting, time. We had visited the sublime, world-famous art gallery, walked along the icy shores of the breathtakingly vast Lake Michigan, shopped, again, seen the sights at night with all the giant skyscrapers lit up, generally absorbed the pre-Christmas atmosphere of a great American city, and now it was time to go home. Poor Norman had been too generous, though, in allowing each celeb to bring along a guest. That convention in Chicago almost broke him financially, especially as everyone present had a penchant for the champagne which he was so kindly paid for, not to mention, in the case of some of us, for eggs Benedict 3 times a day. The news of his monetary deficiency soon spread, and future large-scale WhoCons in the States were never as opulent again, also heavily subsidized. I was never again invited to bring a guest along, and was always tactfully but firmly told that any alcoholic drinks would be on my own personal tab. Fair dues, I thought. I will always be thankful for that first U.S. experience, though. Aptly enough, at Thanksgiving. The Spirit of Light convention is often reminisced about by all of us who attended, and remembered as the best one of all time. That certainly was for me, anyway.